The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
And good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're calling in from. So I want to thank everybody that's joined us early. We are a few minutes out from the start of the live session, but I wanted to come on and just do a quick, couple of quick house cleaning items before we get before we get the meeting started today. First and foremost, for those of you who are on the call right now, if you don't mind, if somebody could either hit the chat or the question function and just confirm that you are hearing me come through loud and clear right now. And I would also ask that our presenter, Jim Cotter, if you can also just unmute for a sec, Jim, and just do a check 1, 2, 3 for me.
Check 1, 2, 3.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay, appreciate that. Got the green light from the audience that they heard us. So that's good. That's the first step. So a couple of other things as we get ready to get started. The session today will kick off promptly at 1 p.m. Eastern time. So we're about 3 to 4 minutes out from starting. So if everybody could just hang on, we're going to come back in about 1 minute and do a couple of pre-webinar announcements. But just hang tight and we'll be right back. Good afternoon or good morning. I want to thank everybody for joining Astrix Technology Group for today's presentation entitled Planning and Executing a LabVantage LIMS Validation. Next slide, please. As we get into today's presentation, I want to give everybody a little bit of a sense of who Astrix is as a company, and then I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. So if you're not familiar with who Astrix is as a company, let me give you a quick and brief overview. We are an informatics professional services and staffing company primarily dedicated to servicing the scientific community here and abroad. Some quick stats about Astrix. The company was established back in 1995. It is privately held today. It began as an IT division of a company called APBI, which was a $300 million life science research organization. Today, we operate from about 8 offices throughout the country with some remote and international, as well as 650 total employees. We are headquartered in Red Bank, New Jersey, and we have 2 primary divisions. There's a staffing division, which is basically servicing private and public staffing for scientific and IT resources, as well as the ProServe division, which is who you're speaking with today. This is a group that focuses on supporting science-based organizations with things like laboratory informatics, LIMS technology, validation, etc. Our target customer, those who do business with us, are Fortune 1000 life science enterprises, government, research institutions with large and fast-growing IT, staffing, and compliance needs. And our mission has always been to deliver scalable, sustainable solutions in IT and staffing for the scientific community. Next slide, please. What these services boil down to, what it looks like, is an end-to-end service span for the complete life cycle of scientific data systems. This is everything from business process analysis to enterprise architecture through lab technology selection services. That's a big facet of some of the things that Astrix does. We go in and help companies choose the right systems to modernize, revamp, or streamline the technology that's used in their laboratory. We do development and implementation. We validate these computer systems that are so common today in the lab. We do laboratory system services, meaning we can do full customization of laboratory software and hardware. And then, of course, we have staffing available to staff and manage those systems if need be. At the end of the day, what we try to do as a company, and what we've done very well over the years, is we let you focus on the science and we focus on the technology. And today's modern laboratories are very much run by technology. So we help you kind of get there smoothly, efficiently, and in the most cost-effective way possible. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do is present, or we're going to transition over to our guest speaker today. It's a gentleman by the name of Jim Cotter. So Jim is, by title, the Managing Informatics Engineer of Astrix Technology Group. What that means is he brings about 15 years of experience in lab informatics within specifically the pharma, biotech, and chemical and consumer products industry. So Jim really brings a lot of proven industry experience in these areas. LIMS and laboratory informatics is kind of his specialty, and everything from project management to process flow diagramming, system configuration, kind of all fall within his wheelhouse. So we're thrilled to have him. I'm going to turn it over to Jim, and Jim, we're going to let you take it here, and I'll pop back on at the end when we can do some questions. But Jim, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Thank you for joining me today for our webinar titled Planning and Executing a LabVantage LIMS Validation. Validating LabVantage laboratory informatics management system with its many configuration options, a LIMS that is highly customizable, and a LIMS that integrates into your company informatics strategies requires significant project planning and a team coordination to be executed successfully. Often aspects of this project are overlooked, or as some projects evolve, changes are necessary. The validation plan should be structured, but at the same time flexible to navigate the challenges of a complex implementation. In our webinar today, we're going to present a process for validating the LabVantage LIMS system. We will also highlight areas that are often overlooked and how to plan for them. The topics that we will discuss today in the webinar are: when should you start planning your validation? What is the most important items to consider when planning and preparing for that validation? How to avoid the common setbacks that many validations encounter, and how to maintain your validated system during its lifetime. So consider that in this traditional software development lifecycle, that validation is an add-on to this activity. It sits at the end of the process. Many organizations approach validation in this manner. It's a necessary evil, something that will be done, that needs to be done before go live. You also hear some people voicing some common excuses for placing it all the way at the end. I have too much to do right now. We don't have a system yet. How can I start validation? I'll get to it. I'll get to it soon. The worst case is validation as an afterthought. So what we want to do is change that model. And a successful validation integrates into the software development lifecycle. Integrating validation into the software development lifecycle allows you to start planning and preparing for your validation early on. Once you start defining a system and the system requirements is when you should begin to plan or start planning your validation. This slide should be familiar to you. It's basic validation process flow with the stages of a LabVantage LIMS validation. We're going to drill down into each of these in more detail, but let's just walk through it at a high level right now. The planning stage. It sets the structure for your validation activities. It's a GAMP requirement. It defines what needs to be done, how it will be done, who will do it, and when will it be done. Specs, you're drafting your scripts, assembling your validation team resources, training that team, and driving those scripts before execution. When you enter the execution stage, this is the busiest, but it's also the most stressful part of the process. There are many moving parts, there are many resources involved, there's always time pressure, and it's a period of all hands on deck. In order for your execution to go smoothly and without chaos and minimizing stress, my recommendation is do more planning and do more preparation. After execution, you go into the review and closeout stage. This is where you finalize your validation and prepare for go live. Your documents are reviewed, you gather your evidence and prepare and submit summary reports for your validation. The system gets commissioned and you plan for and go live with your LabVantage LIMS. Once you're live with the system, you enter the change control phase. After validation, your system will need to be maintained. Have a process in place to maintain the validated and documented system. After all this work you put into it, you don't want to lose control. So let's dig a little bit deeper into each of these stages and talk about how best to validate your LabVantage LIMS system. What to consider when planning your LabVantage LIMS validation. The first thing to consider is your approach to validation. Your corporate guidance, corporate modifying or creating event plans that determine the behavior of certain. Again, event plans are configurable, but adding custom Java actions or writing Groovy code in the event plan is creating new pages, custom JSPs. Again, the toolkit allows for custom JSP pages, but the code for that page is not provided out of the box. That becomes customization. You need to decide how your validation is going to define and handle these types of situations. Lastly, on your approach, you may choose to take a risk-based validation approach to validation. And I'm going to cover the details of that a little bit later when I talk about risk assessments. Sorry. The next thing to consider are your stakeholders. It's pretty clear most of the departments that use the LabVantage LIMS system, the laboratories, manufacturing, warehousing, the QA organization, IT, they're going to be stakeholders in this process. But don't forget about other users of LIMS data, your external customers. Potentially your customer service and sales teams represent them for you. What about your other internal customers like finance, purchasing? They may be stakeholders in this process. There's other process owners within your organization, the training department, the master data group, customer complaints. All of these can be stakeholders with regards to your LabVantage LIMS. Define the review and approval authorities for your validation activities. Who, the people or the functions that will perform review and approval of the validation. these will be members of the stakeholder community that you've considered. The next thing to consider is your architecture. How will your system be built? Are you going to use an Oracle or an MS SQL database? What app server are you using? JBoss, WebLogic, or WebSphere? Who's going to be doing the installation? Will LabVantage be doing it? Will your own internal group be doing it? Or is a third party helping you? Who's providing the hardware? Who maintains that hardware? What environments do you need to have for your system? Do you have a development, a test, a production environment? Maybe you also need a sandbox or a staging environment to test your migration process. What about security? What issues will you have? What planning do you have around your firewalls? Will there be remote access? All this can be documented in an architecture map, which shows the relationship between the servers, the systems, and the users. Lastly, and probably most importantly, and can be neglected or forgotten, is you need to have a backup and recovery plan. And most importantly about it, that backup plan needs to be tested and validated. Next thing to consider are how this system's going to interface. LabVantage LIMS are typically these days not standalone systems. They're highly integrated with the other informatics systems within your organization, your ERP, your MES, your manufacturing systems. You have instrument integrations. It also can be integrated to doc management, training, and maybe your CAPA system. Those integrations can be push, they can be pull, they can be one directional or bidirectional. When you're talking about instrument integrations, are they simple instruments or complex integrations? What tools will you be using to integrate? The LV Connect, LVCI, or others, custom? Consider all of the above when planning your validation. When considering your stakeholders and interfaces, err on the side of caution at the beginning. Consider all touch points. Evaluate the level of interaction. Decide on which aspects need to be validated. Your planning activities need to be documented. We'll start with your requirements. Your functional requirements define what the system must be able to do. Got some examples of typical requirements. Batch record must be able to be created. Create date and create by must be recorded automatically. Fields for product, lot number, line, MBR number must be available for batch records. Your user requirements define how the system is utilized. Some examples of user requirements. When creating batch records, the user is required to enter product, lot number, and MBR number before saving a record. A warning message should appear if any required information is missing. When creating a batch record, the user optionally may enter a manufacturing line number. Your design specification, or sometimes called a config spec or configuration specification, describes how the LabVantage LIMS system is configured or designed above and beyond the out-of-the-box delivered functionality. How the system will be configured, how it will be customized to meet the stated FRS and URS requirements. The last requirement document is the trace matrix. The trace matrix is a living document that aids in linking the requirements to the activities of the validation process. The URS requirement will link to these FRS requirements. Those FRS requirements link to the out-of-the-box or custom design features. And these FRS requirements will be tested by a particular script and script number. You will also be documenting the assessments that you perform. As I mentioned earlier, you may take a risk-based approach to validation. Regardless if you take this approach or not, performing a validation risk assessment can provide true value to your validation effort and your LIMS implementation. It's a documented process to determine the risk class and risk priority associated with each requirement. The first step is to determine the risk class for a requirement. Using a low, medium, and high scale, define the probability of an event occurring that causes that requirement to fail. And then also define the severity of impact if it does, using that same low, medium, and high scale. A low probability event and a low impact event equates to a low risk class. A high probability event with a low impact would likely be called a medium risk class. A high probability along with a high impact will be a high risk class. The next step would be to determine the priority associated with that requirement. The ability to detect the occurrence using that low, medium, and high scale versus the low, medium, high risk class previously determined. A high detectability and a low risk becomes low priority. Medium detectability with a medium risk obviously becomes medium priority. Low detectability with a high risk is a very high priority. In a risk-based validation, you may choose only to test your medium and high priority requirements. This will be defined by your quality organization requirements, but traditionally that's the way it gets approached. Regardless, the risk assessment exercise provides deeper understanding and definition for those requirements. The next assessment to do is a gap assessment. It's a documented process to identify requirements that cannot be met by the LabVantage LIMS system and must be met through other means. And I've got an example. There may be a requirement that the results of a particular assay must be telephoned directly to the manufacturing line operator upon review. As far as I know, LabVantage LIMS doesn't make phone calls, at least at this time. So this requirement must be addressed by other means. What are those other means? Well, those other means are SOPs and work instructions, training, or if necessary, modification of the requirement so that the new requirement can be met as long as it still meets and satisfies the business need. Other assessments that occur during this process are security assessments. What users we have, what are their job types and roles, what departmental security needs to be developed and implemented. This also includes access and login authentication. Your SOPs need to be assessed. Which procedures have an impact on LIMS, or how does the LIMS implementation impact existing procedures? All the touch points should be addressed, aligned, and this will identify which SOPs will require revision. Business process flows should be documented. If they're previously documented, they will likely change. If they're not documented, it's a good activity to document. But these will need to be maintained through the process of implementing your LabVantage LIMS and performing your validation. Let's continue on with documentation. So master data plan. A big part of any LIMS implementation that impacts your validation is master data. Very often, a planned approach to master data has been overlooked, or the realization that a plan is needed occurs too late and is actually identified after master data builds have begun. A master data plan is focused on, but not limited to, parameter lists, test methods, specifications, and their associated records. It also includes sampling plans, schedule plans, templates, all the setup information necessary to run your LabVantage LIMS. The goal of the plan is to define how the business will manage master data, who is responsible for its creation and maintenance, what is the order in which it needs to be built, where is the master data going to be built, tested, and approved, which environments, is there a promotion plan between your environments, you develop your master data in the sandbox, promote it to your test environment and perform a validation or a testing against it, move it to your production environment and approve it. This plan needs to be developed. There also needs to include conventions for naming, the style or approach of creating your master data. Who is involved in the review and the approval of master data, and how do you reference external documentation, your master data records that are external to LabVantage LIMS? The last area of documentation to cover are your procedures. You'll need a documented procedure for deviation management during validation. You will also need an issue management procedure for post-validation activities as issues arise. SOPs, you will need to modify your SOPs, your work instructions, your functional procedures. But a particular SOP that is very helpful and most likely I would call it necessary is a LIMS governance procedure. It should be written, and it should describe the following: who owns and who is responsible for aspects of the LabVantage system? Who owns and is responsible for the infrastructure, the servers and the hardware? Who owns and is responsible for the application and the database? Who maintains that database and performs backups? Who manages the code and patch deliveries when they occur? Who's going to own and be responsible for system configuration? Who's responsible for master data? Who is authorized to make changes? And what's the process for submitting and approving those changes? And lastly, training. You will have to develop training plans. Those training plans will have syllabus and content that has to be documented, and user training requirements and training records will be maintained. Let's talk a little bit about installing the system. Who's going to do it? Is it going to be the vendor who performs the IQ? Does that cover just the out-of-the-box functionality? You need to confirm that any customizations that are built are included in their IQ and delivery. If you do it in-house, will you be doing everything? You need to be very comfortable and competent in the installation process if you are, or will it be a combined effort between the vendor and in-house resources? What's being installed? What needs to be validated? This is the scope of the IQ. What third party or middleware will be installed, like Jaspersoft or Bartender, NWA? Who's doing that as well? We talked a bit about the system architecture in your environments, but there's also aspects about clustering and load balancing, VPN access, security to the servers and environments that need to be planned. Is this a new installation or an upgrade? This presentation is talking about a new installation primarily, but performing an upgrade introduces a number of additional challenges. And we'll take that as another topic for another webinar. Okay, so after all that planning, let's talk about putting your plans into motion during preparation. As I described in the planning, you have a number of assessments to perform. Your assessments can start as soon as the design and development activities are underway. You're going to draft your gap assessment when your system starts to be defined. You'll be able to identify what gaps are going to be present and what SOPs or what training will need to be enacted. You'll finalize that gap assessment when your system is finally delivered. But drafting it early starts the process and helps you gain on your timeline for making those SOP and training decisions later. Your risk assessment, again, will determine what to include in your validation scripts, or to what extent those validation scripts need to cover the requirement. Low priority risk, low scrutiny. High priority requirements will need to get the correct amount of detailed attention in the scripts. Start and maintain your trace matrix throughout. It's a great tool for keeping everything organized and coordinated. Sorry, I jumped 2 slides. There we go. You're going to start drafting your scripts early. Some of those scripts, well, as deliveries of your developed system are provided, you will need to do user acceptance testing. Your drafted scripts can actually be used for that user acceptance testing, or can help develop those scripts during user acceptance testing. If during development something changes in design or in your requirements, your drafted script can be edited. It can be revised. As development activities are completing, you should have the drafts of those scripts reviewed by another person, have another set of eyes on them. You should also plan to dry run those scripts against your completed system, and then make final edits before getting them approved. Your master data plan can be incorporated into the design or configuration spec, or it can be a standalone document. These activities, the assessment, trace matrix, master data, and test scripts, are the meat of your workload. These take effort and focus to be done right. Don't try to rush through it. And most importantly, start early and keep a good pace throughout the design and build phase of the software development lifecycle. In your preparation final steps, you're going to be completing your execution plan. Your scripts will have been drafted. You will have a process to handle your deviations. You will have a process to handle the validation documentation. You have identified and assembled your team, and they are trained. You will define your reviewers and approvers of your validation documents. And very importantly in your signature authority is you should have alternates or delegates to fill in as needed. So very important here, development activities must be completed. They must be halted. Development is finished. UAT has been completed. Any errors or issues have to be addressed or known. Your configuration is complete. Your menus and pages and forms are built. Your reports and labels design is complete and installed. Your instrument integrations are complete. Regarding master data, you need to have enough master data in the system to allow your validation activities to proceed. Some of that is just prerequisites for your scripts. Other master data is required by your URS and FRS. If it's required, it must be in the system before you start your validation. So last call on preparation. You should dry run your scripts. This should be done in a locked environment. We tend to recommend that there's a staging environment that's an exact copy of what your production environment will look like. And this is where you dry run your scripts, your installation, your IQ, your OQ, and then your PQ. Dry run it repeatedly Find the errors and the issues in your scripts, fix them, edit them. Prepare your final versions of your script, your IQ, OQ, PQ scripts, and submit them for approval. While this is happening and continuing into your execution phase, you can complete and review your design and configuration specs if necessary. And you have to have synchronized environments. Where you perform your validation must be equivalent or in your production environment. If you're performing it in like a test environment, then that system must be synchronized with what your production environment will be. If there's differences between your test environment and production, they need to be known, documented, and evaluated for risk in your validation plan. So we're going to go into the execution phase, but I've been emphasizing the importance of planning and preparation. All of this upfront work has the intention of making the execution of the validation go as smoothly as possible. So with execution, you're actually going to execute your scripts, record your evidence, capture your necessary screenshots as additional evidence. If more than one tester is required in a script, the documents will need to be shared and stored. This can be a challenge while we're all working remotely now. Your deviations, there'll be minor deviations. Typically, those minor deviations are identified during execution of the script. They get resolved and reviewed prior to continuing on with the script. You can encounter major deviations. They get also identified during script execution, but they sometimes require escalation, complex resolution, and that may cause a suspension of your validation activities until it has been resolved and reviewed, and then you resume your activities. We recommend executing your scripts with real-time review. Partner up. Have an observer confirming the tester's activities versus the script. You will catch a number of your minor issues during that if you have an observer. Three unique executions are typical in a validation. Your IQ. When you perform your IQ, there are prerequisites. Those need to be completed before you start. You execute the script steps, you record and collect your evidence. Deviations have been managed, there's verification activities going on. Once execution has been completed, you submit it for approval or review and approval, and if necessary, issue a summary report for the IQ. Same process, similar process follows for OQ. Complete your prerequisites. One of those prerequisites is that the IQ has been closed out. Execute those scripts, record and collect your evidence, deviation management, go through approval, and prepare a summary report if it's required by your plan. Lastly is the PQ. Again, completing prerequisites in order to execute, one of those being that your OQ has been completed. You execute those scripts, manage those deviations, go through a verification process, submit for review and approval, and issue a final summary report. These executions are typically 3 distinct activities performed in sequence. There may be reasons for having time gaps between them, not running them sequentially, one right after the other, but typically they are executed in this order. So post execution, review and closeout. All the documentation has been completed. Test scripts have been filled out completely. The deviations noted in the steps. Your attachments are complete and accepted. Your trace matrix is updated. It includes the scripts that were executed against your requirements. All of your deviations have been completed and handled. Evidence and documentation is provided and been reviewed. The resolutions of those deviations have been accepted. There is a potential that a deviation initiates a CAPA process. If the deviation is severe enough, your quality system guidance might determine that a CAPA needs to be issued. If this occurs, you may not be able to close out your validation until the CAPA has been closed. During review of your validation, there's some common findings that we want to mention here for just to keep in mind. Your execution pages of your script are missing signatures or initials next to the evidence. You're missing some screenshots. Your pagination is missing or incomplete, or your log files are incomplete. Specification revisions have not been completed or approved. And worst case, your requirement has not been tested and you've missed requirements. Real-time review, as I mentioned, having an observer during execution can help minimize these review findings and keep focus. So after your validation has been executed, there's the completion process. A summary report document is prepared and submitted. Your validation evidence and documentation all needs to be stored away in your doc management system storage. And then what happens? Your post-validation activities. Those SOPs that you've been revising and considering need to be completed and approved. You need to train your end users, and you need to schedule your go live activities. Once you go live with your LabVantage LIMS system, you'll need to maintain that system, and you'll have to have a change control process for that. Your change management process, it needs to be specifically geared toward computer system. A document change control process or procedure would not be sufficient for this. It needs to address validation plan guidelines, the change management templates that you're going to use, and a risk management plan. It should also reference the master data plan, and it should describe the system update plan, process to accept, install, and verify patches and updates from LabVantage, updating the year file, installing Jasper reports, providing new bartender labels, etc. It should also address maintaining the design and configuration documentation. Let's talk about change control risk management. Low risk changes, for example, master data being updated, new users for the system, labels, some reports new or updated, those are low risk activities for change control. Typically doesn't require system validation, but definitely requires documenting those changes and testing those changes. Medium risk changes, for example, a process change caused an event plan or a policy setting to be modified. A new instrument interface is developed, or a change to the C of A report generation process. These changes will likely require a limited scope and validation or verification scripts. High-risk changes, for example, you're updating the software version. New modules are being deployed, such as implementing instrument certification or reagent lot management, major functionality changes. These may warrant a full or expanded scope validation of your system. So again, let's review where we started, the roadmap to success. Start planning for your validation when you start planning for your LabVantage LIMS implementation. integrate validation into the software development lifecycle. Preparation. Start your preparation work as early as possible. Document your requirements, plan your document and document your activities, draft, review, and revise your scripts, and definitely dry run and practice your executing those scripts before you start your execution. Most of your validation time should be spent in these two activities, planning and preparation. Once you're ready, execute. Like I said, this should be a piece of cake if you're prepared, but it quickly can become a nightmare if you're not. You review and close out once your validation activities have been executed, and you get ready to use the LabVantage LIMS system. And don't forget about change control. Remember, your validation activities never end and are cyclical. Maintain your system validation and documentation through its life. That completes the webinar presentation. Thank you for letting me take time to present this to you.
Thank you, Jim. That's great. I really appreciate the content. You can actually go to the next slide if you don't mind. So a couple things real quick as we wrap up. We want to start to get into a little bit of the questions. I know that the board is pretty, has some lively questions on it. We want to obviously get to them. Obviously, if you've been holding on to any questions throughout the session, please ask them now. And we're going to start to dig into those. So the Astrix approach is something unique that we've developed here at Astrix Technology Group. It's basically a 5-stage process, which is a methodology that's been born out of the collective experience of all the people in the organization, like Jim, who've been working in lab informatics and lab technology now for many, many years. We've boiled that down to this methodology, which is designed to ensure the lab informatics in your organization, that these projects effectively align both the business as well as the technology through, things like setting the right goals and the processes, et cetera. The professionals here at Astrix lead business process transformation efforts by bringing together, that whole technical industry and domain knowledge, which is necessary. Anybody can go out and hire a technologist to come in and program software, but Astrix brings that unique blend of scientific technologists to bear. And it's really where we've born, the company's been born out of that and out of life sciences. So that reputation precedes us. We've got, fantastic people here who are doing great work to help our clients really kind of focus on the science so we can take over the tech for them. We evaluate, we implement, and we manage systems to enhance the collection and processing of scientific data. We'll leave it at that. And again, we want to encourage you to ask questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop the